This is Craig Lane of Health Alchemy with the next in a series of video blogs, Finding the Gold in the Shadow. So if you're not sitting with both feet on the ground watching this, and if you're not totally present, maybe make yourself be so. Because the gold can be found in any moment, at any time. I used to say to myself, peace is only one breath away. It's only one thought away. And it really is that simple. If we look out through our eyes, through what's always and already looking, it's actually a shining thing that has no need or cause or want. And this week's video blog, Finding the Gold in the Shadow, this is sort of a three-part series that I went into related to sort of my vacation and learning more and more about what the ancient alchemists, alchemy goes back thousands and thousands of years, and part of the alchemist tradition is also involved with the Gnostic tradition and some of the great spiritual traditions. They're all tied together. And on the other side of sort of seeking integration and wholeness, there's this shadow. And not that the shadow isn't totally part of the Tao, so to speak, or the mystery, because if the mystery or God is everything, then everything is everything. And we can't throw out one part and say that's not it. And so for me, in terms of last week's video blog, stalking our own experience and finding the freshness of vacation in daily life, I think that there's some key elements here that you'll hear me if you watch me or follow me enough, as I know some of you do. I kind of like having sort of a small audience, so I don't have too much to answer to and too many contradictions to answer to. As my teacher, said, if you hear me talk long enough, I just loved his vulnerability and freshness and transparency about if you hear me talk long enough, you'll hear me contradict myself constantly. And that's because, in the Tao Te Ching, there's a saying, true words aren't charming, charming words aren't true. And there's many other variations of that saying throughout the lines in the Tao Te Ching. And, there's a lot of great spiritual texts that have allusions to this, with the word allusion, to allude to. And that's, I think that there's sort of like finding the gold. I used to be puzzled by reading books about great spiritual teachers, and they would thank people that caused them trouble. And you talk about finding the gold, I think there's a certain level where we start to see oh wow, thank God for this experience, because it helped me see something and integrate something more about this shadow into the light and these old patterns. And so I had an experience through a family constellation on my vacation. It was such a rich experience on the vacation that there were a series of sort of squeezes in the early first 4 or 5 days of the trip, especially being with a partner that's interested in truth and consciousness and honesty and transparency. I did something called, with her, at her behest actually, something called a family constellation with a couple of counselors up in, I believe it was in Petaluma. And I was able to, in that experience, through their expertise, I was able to sort of step out of myself and become what it felt like as I was a 6 to 8 year old again. And I was observing my parents and my family acting out some patterns, quite brilliantly done, to be honest. And in the acting out of those patterns, I was able to find some gold. And, I had this little 6 to 8 year old, and his needs were never met by anyone in the family, and that's not their fault. What I got to see there is one of the exercises and daily sort of challenges that they told me I would probably need to do is to bow to my father's lineage and bow to my mother's lineage, and I'm also bowing a third time more deeply now. They said the deeper you bow, the more sort of integrated the experience will be. And so, in the shadow of what I saw of this traumatized child who had a lot of great things happen in his childhood, as we all do. I think a lot of us look back and we say, "Oh, my childhood was so great," and we forget about the bad stuff. Or, when someone dies, we say all the bad or the good things about them. We forget the other side of it. And I know I had a great childhood, and I know that more than ever now, I know that, I thank my parents for they were doing their best and working within a system that's sort of rigged. And if we're going to create a better world, then we need to love the world we came from, and because it is what is. And so the gold I found was that, I honor my parents more than ever, and there was a man on my father's lineage that I don't know if this is fact because I don't have the facts, but my father's grandfather was a man I was able to connect with through this family constellation, and his grandfather, which would be I would be 5 generations removed from, is where the current sort of samskara or scar in my male lineage comes from. And so the gold I found only through jumping into that pain and allowing myself to be vulnerable and transparent with these people, my girlfriend and these 2 counselors, I was able to sort of find the gold on the other side of this shadow. And finding the gold in the shadow, I think, is something that, we'll be leading workshops in my practice. I don't like to use this YouTube channel as a sort of promotional channel, and I won't, other than just, I think I have clients that, a few of them that are on antidepressants, and I think that that's one of the main, they're not able to jump into that void. But I've had 2 of them tell me it's like when they go off the antidepressants, they feel that there is a void, and that's exactly right. St. John of the Cross talked about the dark night of the soul, and for each of us, we're in a spiritual time of great, great opportunity. And I know for one that freedom for me is not found in bypassing a state through a substance. And I've done that with the worst of them, with marijuana and alcohol at times, although I'm not preferentially a drinker. And mainly with marijuana, mainly through meditation and some of my yogic practices I learned over the last 25 years. I think that we all become great alchemists in our own world of spiritual bypass and emotional bypass. And we forget that in Chinese medicine, they talk about, if you spend a lot of your energy in worry and anxiety, that takes energy away from your earth element, which is your digestive tract. And so I translate that as we're digesting on a lot of levels. And if we get indigestion or constipation, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, then the gold isn't going to present itself, because we have to digest and poop it out, so to speak, to move on to seeing the gold. Because often we don't see the gold in any experience until we've, sort of barfed it, pooped it, sweat it, enema it, out. That's figuratively also, as well as, figuratively, symbolically, literally, whatever way you want to see that. And that's why I lead cleanses, and that's why I'm going to be leading some kind of online program for people to have opportunities to really get some support, because counseling, I think that there's like a pitcher in a baseball game, and the starting pitcher gets you to a certain point, and then there's the relievers, and then there's the closing guy. And I don't know of too many counselors that I've seen in my practice that take someone from beginning to end. And I know my spiritual teacher sort of calls himself something like a closing pitcher in spirituality. Some people are anywhere from 1 day to 20 years into their meditation practice before they finally want to get the deal closed, so to speak. And I know that I was interested in that, and not that the deal's closed with me, because it never is. And that's part of the realization that, as long as I'm here, I'm subject to the laws of duality and being in a body, and just finding peace and joy with that as best I can. So in finding this gold, the experience I want to really relate in this video blog is the family constellation led to a certain squeeze, and then we were with some family, and so it was with some family, I would call them family friends, because we were where we were together time 15 or 20 years ago when we were building community and really learning what it was to be in bodies and really connect on a level that I'd never had before. And that was the beginning of a sort of maturation. And so that, bringing my girlfriend into that, who had never been part of this with me, got to see sort of Craig Lane as he was and who he is now, and really see how much love there is outside of our own love, and how loved I was and how much love I have. And that generated a certain state of being. And then we had an experience on the Trinity River where, for lack of a better word, did some yogic practices on the river. We'd done an enema, and I was basically doing a yogic practice right on the river on the sandy bank. And I felt myself, like, there was a sense of, like, I call them cycles within cycles within cycles. And in one of my cycles, I've often felt like what once took 21 years for me to break my neck and complete one chapter, then they've been spinning in from 21 years to maybe 5 years, or 9 years was the next chapter. And then there was a couple year cycle where it's like these rebirths and these rebirths. And I think I've spun through maybe at least one a year in the last few years, especially with my partner. And this most recent one was only, it was literally only a few days to a few weeks, and sort of died in that experience and had a certain level of lightness and ascension. And then she was taking a nap, and I had gone across, it wasn't a deep river, but I walked across the river and was laying on this rock, and I felt her wake up and felt myself sort of in this out of sort of seventh chakra, if you put it. I just hate using those words of the spiritual cliche of the chakras, but very ascended in light. And then I could feel her presence, so it sort of drew what I would call myself back in. And then I remember we just laid down on either side of the river looking at each other, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm ready to come back and do this again. And I've been given that choice many times in my life, and sort of leave my body and in death, and keep choosing to come back for whatever reason, because I'm not cooked yet. And so finding the gold in this round was basically, wow, I worked through some processes and got squeezed, and then Shasta squeezed something out of me, really not buying into, like, what's wrong with me? I'm feeling a lot of shadow here in this city. Instead, just saying, there's shadow here, and part of it's my own shadow being triggered. And really there was a great moving on from that, and then coming back. I don't know if anyone's even going to understand this, because my teacher does a great job putting experience into sort of coherent words, and I'm doing my best here to say, when I came back in and then drove home on the latter leg of that trip the last 2 days, and came home to dead plants and having to move my house and prepare and work, and there was another cycle that I haven't spun out of yet. And in this current sort of incarnation that's only about, it's actually a little more than a week old, I'm curious to see how this particular one is going to end, because the gold in this current one, as I'm finding it, is that it's just the grit and really being present with what is and being connected, because my mission statement in life now is, I create a world of harmony by connecting. I create brightness by shining is another one that I like. And so, when I'm not bright, when I'm not shining, when I'm not connected, when I feel disharmonious, there are markers to me to look inside. And so, the gold, finding the gold in the shadow, is that the yin-yang symbol is there for a reason. You have a little white within the dark and a little dark within the white, is that there's this constant dance. And I think what I want to relay here is that, as I mentioned in last week's video blog, I was going to explain, that experience, and that was the best I could do, is of coming back in, choosing to be sort of reborn, and then these fresh eyes looking out and saying, what's not whole yet, and really, what is the world, what is my world looking like, and how can I find some residue of peace and hope. And I've really been presented with that more and more lately, of synchronicities and getting an email that really showing how the the powers that are running the world are desperate because they're seeing that people just aren't putting up with it anymore. And part of it's the war in Syria, and part of it is the financial systems really changing, and part of it is the military. As I saw in one email, the military is actually getting ready potentially to back the Federal Reserve collapse here in this country, and the Federal Reserve being changed over to an actual treasury. And that gave me a lot of hope, because I had believed that the military, for the most part, was under the hands of some really greedy and corrupt people. But that just gave me a lot of hope that maybe there is people running in the military who do care enough to back truth and the people. Because the common man, the most common man in the military is the common man, and the common man, just wants his simple pleasures, and I'm one right there with them. I just want to have my garden and my community, and I don't need to buy eggs from fucking Wisconsin. I don't need to buy milk from New York. I don't need to find friendship through Facebook or YouTube necessarily. I think that that's the value of, connecting one-on-one right here, right now in conversation. I know that this is not necessarily so that I can choose to delete and edit this. It's one of the problems, I think, with if there's a shadow in the current generation, is that, one-on-one conversations where it's at, and that's where you're challenged and really held to the point of like what's going on. And you can choose how you text, you can choose how you talk on the phone, but you cannot choose necessarily sometimes in those face-to-face interactions. And that's the challenge I have for today's generation. And I know I'm not perfect, but there's some great things to do with media. But one of the things I think, finding the gold, and there's the gold in that shadow of like, yeah, technology's great, and we need to also use it and not be used by it. So this is Craig Lane with another bit of a fun, rambling video blog on finding the gold in the shadow, and looking forward to leading a cleanse coming up, leading a group cleanse. You can actually do it almost anywhere in the United States or anywhere in the world if you're that into it, because we're going to be interfacing through the internet and through YouTube. So large intestine cleanse coming up in a few weeks. You can go to my website, healthalchemy.com, HealthAlchemy, healthalchemy.com. My only shameless plug during this video blog. Namaste.